Howard Amos is a writer and journalist who has been published by various outlets, including The Guardian, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy, The Associated Press, and The New Republic. Raised in London, he spent a year living in Russia's Pskov region before working for almost a decade as a correspondent in Moscow. He left Russia in the days after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and, based out of Armenia, did a year-long stint as editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times in exile. He now lives in Edinburgh. We're going to talk about a whole range of different subjects, of course, also including this fantastic book called Russia Starts Here, which is written. There's going to be a description of that, a link to that in the description of the video. It comes highly recommended for anyone that's really interested in getting the sort of texture of Russian life and learning a bit more about regions which are, I think, seldom visited by foreigners. Before we jump in, thank you to everybody who supports the channel, who becomes a patron, buys me a coffee, and of course, if you comment and share these videos, it really does help for new people to discover the content we're producing and the fantastic guests. And finally, the last plug is going to be, please do help with the series of events that we're running this year. Of course, the logistics, travel, etc., hiring film crews, that all costs money. You've been incredibly supportive to get our events off the ground in January in Ukraine, and we have a new series of events coming up in Lviv, Kyiv, and ODESA. That's coming up in May, and you'll be able to see the results of all that on the channel this year. Howard, welcome to Silicon Curtain.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with, well, we won't start with the book. We'll get onto that in a minute. Let's start with your essential ejection from Russia or your requirement really to leave that. But you were there in the build up to the war period. Did you have a sense that you'd have to leave? Did you have a sense that momentous events were coming down the line, let's say in 2021 or even earlier?
Um, so I was sort of between Russia and the UK in the build up to the war, and then in February 2022, I was in Moscow. So I was there for the sort of the few weeks prior to. Um, I mean, I do have to confess that I didn't think that Putin would do it. Um, for a variety of reasons. I think looking back. I mean, I was one of those people who thought Putin was much more cautious, that he wouldn't risk doing something like that. I'd spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine. I realized it wasn't going to be like a cakewalk. They weren't going to be, going to be able to take Kiev, without, a huge bloody fight. Like, I mean, I think so I think that's partly why I didn't think it was going to happen. I mean, I think the other thing is, I was coming up from a sort of political sort of angle, and Putin has really been, well, was really, was a sort of careful, wily KGB officer, right? And it seemed a sort of big departure. I mean, I think I thought it was possible, but when people asked me, I said that on balance, I think it's unlikely. And then looking back, there are lots of people who got it wrong. I think most people really got it wrong, and apart from the military analyst, right? With the people who were looking at where the troops were and like what the troop movements on the ground, and I mean, those people called it. And I do remember thinking at the time, these guys know what they're talking about, and they, yeah, worth listening to
Yeah.
in such circumstances.
Well, we didn't hear from him, but we have heard since then, which is the former head of MI6C. And I think he said, yes, there was all the intelligence stuff, but even then, it was still, when you look at it from a rational lens, it seems like complete madness, in fact. I think that's why most Russian opposition, genuine opposition, and
Yeah.
people of like Shindorovich and others, Vladimir Ilya Varlamov and others, they were saying that there's no way this is going to happen because, of course, they were, I would say, thinking with the same rationality that we were, that this is not something you can just win. You can't just walk in there and
Yeah.
take it over. And yet the head of MI6, C as it were, said, yes, you've got all that evidence, etc., but sometimes you have to go with other evidence. And for him, the convincing part was Putin's so-called historical thesis, or his version of Mein Kampf, basically.
Mhm.
That's the one that got me as well, because it's so deranged, but it's not just a piece of propaganda. It genuinely, seems to be believed, the prejudices, the mythologizing in there. There's something, disturbingly heartfelt about it. And I thought, well, if you're that detached from reality, and this isn't just a hollow facade, then yes, your information might be very, very poor. But you're right. I mean, most commentators, and especially those who have experience of Russia, including correspondents, most didn't think there was going to be something like that. And of course, Pskov is an interesting reason. Let's go. How did you end up in Pskov? Because it's rather an unusual place. I mean, a lot of people, let's say, who are immersing themselves in Russian or as students or whatever, go to places like Voronezh or St. Petersburg, which was, where I went, and there are a few other towns as well, or Moscow, obviously, is the obvious one. But if you want to immerse yourself in sort of provincial life and, let's say, study the language for a while, Pskov is a curious choice. What led you there?
Yeah, so I didn't actually study Russian at university. I studied history at university, and the first time I went to Pskov was while I was at university. I was so I was studied Russian at school, and I was looking for something to do to get language practice. I wanted to go to Russia, and um, a friend sent me this this Russian charity that ran summer camp at an orphanage in Pskov region, the state orphanage in Pskov region. They were looking for people to volunteer. So it was mostly Russians, but they had a few foreigners that went every year. So I came across this email, and it sort of fitted what I was looking for. So I went. So the summer camp was, this orphanage was in the middle of nowhere in Pskov region. It was about an hour and a half by car from Pskov, which was the capital, I ended up there for a month.
And the Russian provinces are, well, so I'd say not for the faint-hearted, but the Russian provinces are very different, aren't they, from Moscow? If Moscow and St. Petersburg is your only experience of Russia, you can have a very distorted view of what life is like. Head outside the capital, often you don't even have to travel that far. You're back in a very different world, often quite a sort of underprivileged and run down, sometimes forgotten about world. Curiously, I went to Pskov as well, but that was already some kind of business related thing. I was doing some research for a high tech Western bed manufacturer, and they picked a whole bunch of hospitals at random, literally none of which could afford these beds or were at all interested. And the only hospital in Moscow and St. Petersburg that could afford those beds was run by an elite that really weren't interested in talking to Western companies. They knew where they'd get their beds from without market research. But I ended up in a two hospitals in Pskov. One was an asylum, which was quite disturbing,
Uh-huh.
and the other one was a curious provincial hospital that seemed quite nicely equipped actually, and the director's boardroom had a huge long walnut table with wood lining the boardroom and various, rather tacky gold statuettes and various things. In other words, this looks like some kind of, mafia boss's den. And it turned out that he was one of the leaders of the White House putsch, and quite well connected in the Duma, and he'd been sent to exile in Pskov, but with quite a bit of the stolen whatever he'd managed to bring with him.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, to your point about the Russian regions being a sort of world unto themselves. I mean, I grew up in London, and you know, the first place I went in Russia was St. Petersburg, and then spent a little bit of time in Moscow, and then ended up in Pskov. And I always thought, life in St. Petersburg and Moscow, is very different to life in London, but it's closer to life in London than life in the regions is to, life in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The gulf between Moscow and St. Petersburg, which I think only got wider, when I was in Russia, fueled by what happened in the 1990s, really, and it was very striking, that sort of how people live, how people think, what they do, the opportunities available, if in these provincial towns, which really are the bulk of where most Russians live. It was very striking, and unlike anything, it's true of all countries, right? There's a gulf between how people live in the cities and the capital city, and but it was very striking in Russia.
Yeah, that contrast is far, far greater, isn't it? Materially, and it also feels in some ways you're projected back to, or can get an impression of what the Soviet Union perhaps was like, whereas a lot of the vestiges of that have been swept away in the capitals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean in Moscow. I lived in Moscow and traveled to Moscow regularly for almost 15 years, and it has changed so much in that time. It was just like extraordinary. The money, the sheer amounts of money that were plowed into infrastructure and rebuilding and building new buildings and parks and like renovating stuff. It was just it was a different place. Really. Whereas, some of that, that sort of oil money of the 2000s, did trickle down to the regions and, and actually, interestingly, in Moscow, the redevelopment of the city that was done under Mayor Sobyanin and began famously with Gorky Park in, I don't know, it was the 2010, 2011, that sort of period when Gorky Park was sort of falling down, run down place, and they turned it into a really nice park, and then that sort of model spread across the whole city and across other parks. So that actually, interestingly, sort of a decade later, you would see in some of the towns in Pskov region, they'd redo the park, or like they'd redo some of the paving stones, and sort of copy that sort of Moscow like model, that sort of beautification. So you would see bits and pieces of that in sort of towns, a decade, 15 years later. But really, I felt that was just sort of that was on the surface. Really, if you could go a bit deeper, nothing really had changed. In fact, I think in a lot of ways things have got worse for people living in these sorts of places.
And ironically, I mean, the Soviet Union had that same trick, didn't they? You beautify a few central parts, and if foreigners ever turn up, you take them to those. This is the Potemkin village kind of approach to civilization, where you create stuff that looks reasonable, and you don't let people see the rest. Pskov, of course, is a border region, and that's a curious thing about borders, and that ties up with the war, doesn't it? Because there have been a number of instances where Putin has said, Russia doesn't have borders, with a kind of smirk on his face. But places like Pskov, Kursk, Belgorod, and others, these are sort of hinterlands. And they also hint at other things as well, don't they? Sort of trauma of the Second World War, First World War, although all hint of that was of course erased by the Soviets. And the idea of ethnic cleansing, that in the past the constituent populations of these places may have been somewhat different, their characters may have been somewhat different. What's the impression you have of these so-called borderlands amid the idea that Russia is perhaps confused about where it begins and where it ends, and what belongs to it and what belongs to other people?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Pskov's history is always found fascinating. So it was, in the medieval period, it was a city-state along with Novgorod nearby, and it got wealthy off the back of trade between the east and west, basically sending things like furs and honey westward, and other stuff coming from Europe into Russia, as did Novgorod. And it was very much on the borders of the sort of Slavic world. There was constant wars with sort of Teutonic Knights, sort of Swedes, Poles. The fighting sort of went. There was a lot of trade, and then there was a lot of fighting, and then then Pskov was incorporated into the expanding Muscovite empire in the 15th century, and then after and then it remained on the sort of the borders of the sort of Russian world, and then eventually the Russian Empire moved westward and incorporated the Baltics, Poland, and so on, and Pskov became a bit of a backwater. Like, it was no longer a border region. So for a few centuries it was I can kind of forgotten really. And it came back to this sort of border sort of role only really with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991 and the Baltic states became independent, there was an international border where once, for centuries before, there'd been nothing. So it's only really in the last 30 years that Pskov has again found itself as a border region. And it was very interesting, talking to people there about how they see the city, right? So some people, I think you probably associate with more liberal orientation, they would see the border, being on the border, as an opportunity, right? When the Baltic states acceded to NATO and the EU in the early 2000s, some people thought that was an opportunity. Like Pskov should use that, for trading, ties to Europe, and could get wealthy off that, and sort of return maybe sort of this echo of this sort of successful city state on Russia's borders, which had a much more democratic political tradition than Moscow did. But then others, which and this is really what holds sway in the city at the moment, others see the city as an outpost, right? A sort of Western outpost of Russia, of orthodoxy, that is defending Russia's Western flank from insidious invaders, whether they be Nazi Germans or Poles or whatever whatever historical period you can look at, and they're very hostile to what is across the border, and they see enemies, and that plays into Pskov is home to this, which I talk about in the book, this paratrooper, this famous Russian paratrooper division, the 76th, and they've been involved. Well, most famously, they were the ones who were stationed in Bucha when they carried out the atrocities there. But they've been involved in every sort of Russian military adventure, over the last 30 years. They're sort of seen as crack troops. So those sort of traditions, that plays into this idea as Pskov as this watchtower of orthodoxy on Russia's western flank.
And being a border region, I mean, in other countries, border regions would thrive, actually. If we look at Lviv now, for instance, it's absolutely booming because of its proximity to the European Union, proximity to Poland, its center as a center of culture, learning, but also technology, absolutely thriving. In the Soviet Union, it also became a kind of lost border area because it was just another component within this sort of Warsaw Pact. And there's a fantastic book about it, describing it just after independence. I think Anna Reid, I think, is the author. And it really describes it as something that's almost like flotsam, washed up on the shore, the tides retreated. It lacks kind of purpose. It's obviously got this historical grandeur, but it's lost any real meaning or purpose because of the the tide of the Russian Empire has moved further away. I got that impression from places like Novgorod and others. You get these sort of echoes of past greatness, of what they could have been, a different civilizational direction they could have taken. But all of that then becomes almost meaningless, almost like just a theme park with the grand Kremlins of the buildings. Do you get that sense with Pskov? Is it perhaps exacerbated even now because it should be thriving as a border between Russia and Ukraine as a sovereign state? In that respect, it could have an extraordinary future, but now it's stuck in this sort of war zone, zone of hostility.
Well, Pskov borders Estonia and Latvia. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That it's yeah, in the medieval period, Pskov was this it was city state, and it had a democratic tradition. The leaders were elected by this veche, this sort of medieval sort of parliament, And that's how it was governed. And if you like, for example, the legal traditions in Pskov, they draw much more heavily on European legal traditions than they do on Slavic ones. Um, Pskov wasn't. There was an organization called the Hanseatic League that traded in the medieval period in the Baltic, all across the Baltic. So as far west as what's today northern Germany. And Pskov wasn't a member of that, but it was very closely tied into that, as was Novgorod. So like they very much looked westward at that point. And there is those traditions, as you say, there's nothing really left of those traditions apart from some amazing buildings and the Kremlin and beautiful churches. But I mean, I would maybe argue, like, Pskov has one of the, perhaps most famously, one of the things that certainly Russians, I think, would associate with the city, is it's home to this guy called Lev Schlossberg, who's one of the few sort of genuine opposition leaders in Russia who is not in jail. And he lives in Pskov, and one of the chapters of the book is about him and his story. And he obviously treads a very fine line at the moment between opposing the war and what he's able to say about that opposition, and not end up in jail. And he, in some ways, I think he embodies that. If you're looking for that tradition, whether it's alive in Pskov today, I mean, he perhaps embodies that. And they have, like, the symbol of Pskov in the medieval period was the bell, which summoned people to the Veche, this assembly. There is a statue of a bell in Pskov today. So there are little echoes of this history, but yeah, it's a relic. Yeah.
Before we get into some of the characters, 'cause I'd love to hear about some of the different people you met there. That's also a sense you get in someone like Novgorod or even Suzdal, Vladimir, and other, so-called golden ring towns, that they could have gone in another direction. There's these ideas or stories of what was maybe the foundations of potentially, republics or other modes of governance. Now, not just, the government's defined by the Muscovite vertical of power. It also, I would say, has almost a genocidal approach to anyone who will try to think of any alternatives or develop any kind of alternatives of governance. Did you get that sense there's anything left of these democratic traditions and ideas in Pskov?
I mean, apart from this opposition leader that I was telling you about, Lev Schlossberg, I mean, not really. It's very hard to find echoes of that. But I mean, this book, my book, it's it's not a very optimistic read. You don't read it and you feel optimistic about Russia's future. When people say to me that it's sort of depressing, and I mean, I would more or less agree, but I would also say that reading about Pskov and understanding Pskov does give you there is this alternative model there. It was a long time ago. The echoes are very faint today, but there is a Russian democratic tradition, if you want to put it like that. Maybe that's strong, but there is history of democracy in Russia. And if at some point the country want to, sort of change politically, there is a history in which it can draw.
And does it suggest to you perhaps that if democratic forces to emerge, it has to come from a far more ground roots sort of level, bottom up rather than top down, and possibly emerge from, let's say, sort of city states or far smaller units of community identity? Because that's the other thing that the Soviet Union slash even modern Russia has it's either, well, modern Russia hasn't really fostered these local identities or really supported them, and Soviet Russia was actively hostile in trying to erase them. Whereas if you read something like Turgenev, sketches from Hunter's albums on, you do get a sense that there is a distinct local culture. People describe themselves foremost as a resident of a certain place. And you have discussion of the different characteristics and modes of life and identities. And identity, I think, Ukrainian revolution shows that actually decentralization of power and building democracy back up at a local level, in combination with strong local identities, is actually quite a powerful tool. again, something like Pskov could be an interesting case for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that again, that was another reason why, I wrote the book was that, I mean, I've always been, Russia's such a huge country, but uh, and there's so much local history there, and there are local communities often very embattled and, restricted in what they can do, but like these things exist, and it's always fascinating to go and try and find them. I mean, one of the examples from the book is that there's a chapter about a woman who got very interested in local history, about in Jewish history, which had been erased by the Soviet Union because the southern part of Pskov region was part of the Pale of Settlement, where the Russian Empire confined all its Jews, and most were assimilated during the Soviet period or killed during the Holocaust. So there are no Jewish people left there today. But uh, and there's not much interest, today even in Jewish history. It's very much a sort of her personal campaign. So she has no funding. She's written dozens of books about this town and this district's sort of history, and about Jewish history in particular. She's this extraordinary like font of knowledge. So there's what in Russia, I'm sure you'll know, the krayovidение, like the sort of local history, is people who they're not in conflict with the state as such, but they get no support from the state, but they preserve like memory, right? And the history, which is despite the lack of funding, the lack of interest, and sometimes the outright hostility to what they're doing. Even people, local historians who might be pro-regime, right? If you're going to be a historian of the local area, you have to understand what happened. So they're often much closer to, the truth than the propaganda, right? I've other things I researched, I talked to quite a lot of these local historians, and they, even if they are, pro-war and pro-regime, they kind of do understand, like they're not taken in by the sort of propaganda sort of narrative. So I've always found these sort of pockets of knowledge, which these sort of communities that you're talking about, they're completely fascinating. Yeah. And I think, as you say, potentially something that could be drawn on in a sort of different political environment.
And of course, it gets more contentious when you may be the resident of lands that were, I would say, I'd use the word stolen, but obviously in the context of geopolitics, they have more highfalutin terms for this. But places like Karelia and the former territories of Finland, or even, I guess, Kaliningrad. I mean, none of us have been to Kaliningrad, and I guess the chances of going there are very slim, especially now. But that must be even more contentious in those kind of places to examine local history, because it's the history of state level theft and expropriation of land, territory, buildings, and yeah, the cleansing of those lands of their former residents. So it can be quite contentious in these borderlands to study history, because you're shedding light on in many cases a sort of imperial process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's true of Pskov region in places. I mean, their best examples of that, I think, that I came across were to do with the Second World War, right? Obviously, in Russia, there's very much a sort of canonical narrative about the Second World War. One of the best examples was, Pskov. The city of Pskov was very badly damaged during the war, and I think if you if you read about it at a superficial level, you'll read that the Nazis destroyed it when they retreated from the city in whatever it was, 44, I think, early 44. But actually, a lot of the damage was done by Soviet bombers. They bombed the city, when the Nazis were there, and caused incredible damage to it. So, I mean, it's maybe a slight distinction, because obviously, the war was the Nazis' fault, but like, actually, a lot of the damage was done by Soviet bombers. And there are lots of, like if you're an expert on the history of Pskov in the Second World War, you of course know that, but it's maybe not something that you can sort of talk about too loudly, because it throws up all this ambiguity about the war, which is not welcome.
But it's also important potentially for people to know that. It's important for people potentially to know what the Russian army is like, the highly abusive or systemically abusive character of the army. I mean, in the 90s, that seemed to be quite widely understood and known. People would go to extraordinary lengths to try and find the money to pay for whatever doctor certificate you needed to exempt your child from that. They wouldn't necessarily want to share that information with a foreigner, and certainly lots of tourists and so on. But once you start to have sort of closer friends or be embedded with certain families, as it were, then you start to sort of get a sense of this sort of culture. They feared their own army, and they would do anything to prevent people from falling into it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that knowledge is still sort of widespread or whether Putin's regime has been able to sort of cleanse some of that. But we see the abusive behavior. So if you have that knowledge, it might help because it might prevent you going to fight in Ukraine, not because you necessarily care about Ukraine and Ukrainians, but you have a clear-eyed view of what your own army's culture and behavior is like. And similarly, the stories of the Second World War, we see some anecdotal evidence, at least, that the liberated territories of Kursk are suffering actually far more under the yoke of their own troops and the sort of chaotic, sort of thieving behavior, so the rapes and the violence, which weren't really occurring under, as far as we can tell, weren't occurring under Ukrainian occupation. So having an understanding of this history could in some instances save your life. And if you believe the propagandistic version, then yeah, that's going to come as quite a shock, the reality.
Yeah, I mean the other like interesting example of that I came across was so most of the Pskov region was occupied by the Nazis during the Second World War, and obviously there was a lot of collaboration as there was everywhere where the Nazis were, but that was obviously that was swept under the carpet. That was not something that people wanted to talk about, and what people wanted to talk about when it came to Pskov and the war was the partisans, right? The sort of underground resistance. And so in the Soviet Union, that was, the later Soviet Union particularly, they were sort of, I mean, there was a lot of resistance then, like further westward in Belarus and other places, the Soviet Union that occupied, there was a lot of partisan resistance, but the partisans were also brutal with the local people, right? And that's not something you come across it's not something that's very easy to come across when you're reading about it and trying to understand what happened in these places during the war. But I was lucky enough. One of the first people I met in Pskov region was this elderly couple, and particularly this woman called Nina in this little village near the orphanage, and she's now 90, and she was there. She remembers the Nazi occupation. So she could tell you firsthand about the brutality of the partisans, and she made little distinction between the Nazis and the partisans in terms of the suffering they caused to her family, which to me, I think when I first heard it was a bit shocking, because I think in my head was this, you had this sort of image of the partisan, the anti-Nazi partisan, as a heroic figure, which is true in the West as well. But yeah, I mean, it was, and I'm sure obviously it depended on personalities and so on, but her stories, firsthand stories of living in an occupied area for several years, and when the partisans used to come to the village, it was very clear that in terms of the suffering they brought her family, there wasn't much difference between partisans and the Nazis.
In that respect, I mean, it has echoes of the Russian Civil War, doesn't it? And again, with the Soviet sort of whitewashing of certain areas of history, or red washing, the experience of the First World War had to be expunged, and no mention of the heroism or whatever of troops. That was a capitalist war, and it doesn't fit the narrative. And equally, these kind of stories, they wouldn't want those propagated at all. Everything has to be told in big, bold, black and white, sort of propagandistic steps. But the chaos and extraordinary violence, much of it purposeless, of the Civil War, that there's echoes, aren't there, in the Second World War? And I guess it's only, 30 years apart.
Yeah. I mean, you forget that period, between 1914 and 1945, it's not very long, and the amount of violence that took place particularly in areas like Pskov, which are border regions, is difficult to comprehend. it's not just war; it's also the collectivization of the peasantry, which Stalin, the Stalin, the terror of the 1930s. It's an extraordinary amount of. I mean, this is things like Timothy Snyder has written about this, like Bloodlands, this region of Eastern Europe, if that's what you want to call it, which just saw incredible amounts of like loss of life in that 1914-45 period.
And also a breakdown of civilization. I think one can class it as all the rules and norms dissolve into a sort of random acts of trauma and violence. What other characters made an impression on you? Because there's so many characters in the book, and what I found interesting is it's some of the stories, and when I first went to Russia, I had this sense, and it's very, very simplistic, but I just asked the question, is this person a sheep or a wolf? Are they at the bottom or at the top? Are they on this vertical of power in any sense, or are they simply inconsequential to it, living their lives outside of that. And you actually cover both of those off. You have people from different spectra. Was that a conscious thing, or obviously when you crafted the book it was, but when you went out to meet people, did you constantly try to find people who'd held power, sought power, as well as ordinary individuals?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. I wanted to do both really for the book. I mean, the idea for the book, when I was selecting these stories of people, some of the stories of people I'd known for a long time, others, I met especially for the book. But when I was selecting the stories that I included, and there were lots of others that I wanted to include but decided not to. When I was selecting the ones that I included, the idea was that they would illustrate something bigger. So this is not the idea. Is it's not just a sort of portrait of one Russian region, but it is that, but it's a portrait of the region that also tells you something about the country as a whole, and how Russia, modern Russia, Putin's Russia, how that functions. So that was kind of what I was holding in my head when I selected a lot of these stories. Yeah.
Let's turn to your other experience there, because of course you have worked. I mean, it would be classed as opposition media. I think in our terms, it is simply media. It's simply a collection of people sort of doing excellent work and striving towards truth. Your experience of the Moscow Times. Now, I'm fascinated by that because, of course, in the context of full-scale war, it has been declared not just as a foreign agent, but as I think it's a that's a sort of undesirable organization. And that puts some extreme pressures, I think, on not just the organization, but on everybody associated with it. And of course, you've held a very senior position there as editor for a period of time. I'd be fascinated to hear about how it is, operating a media organization, which at the same time is seen as essentially an enemy of the state and a tool of Western aggression, which of course it's not.
Right. Yeah. So I was. So I actually, have quite a long history with the Moscow Times. So it was my first job when I moved to Moscow, and I was a reporter there. And I worked for a stint then, and then I left, and I came back, worked for another stint, and then most recently I was editor in chief there for a year between shortly after the full scale invasion until sort of summer of 2023. So it was an interesting time to be an editor, because everyone had left, along with all other independent journalists, more or less, shortly after the tanks went across the border into Ukraine, and so people were scattered all over Europe, Central Asia, South Caucasus, and I was based in Yerevan, so I didn't meet a lot of the staff, and it was sort of doing a lot of coordination of people. At that point, Moscow Times wasn't an undesirable organization. So on paper, there was nothing criminal about, talking to the Moscow Times or being associated with the Moscow Times. It is difficult, right, with these, now talking to people inside Russia, and I think this is an experience that any reporter, independent, journalist trying to write about Russia has, is that people are very suspicious, and you can understand them, right? Because I think we all understand that risks are real, So I don't know. It was often a question. You just have to be prepared to let more people be anonymous. Um, you have to work a lot harder to speak to people. Yeah, and you just have to accept that sometimes it's going to be impossible to do that. I mean, the other nuance which I always found, which is sort of I mean, it's an ethical dilemma for all journalists, but it was particularly acute, right? It's like some people don't think there's any risk, and some people are or don't really understand the risks. So as a journalist, you kind of have to gauge that a little bit, don't you? If you speak to someone, you're going to use their full name, and they're going to say something, very critical of the regime or of the war. You have to think: is that an ethical thing to do? Even if the person you're quoting wants you to use their or is giving you permission to use their full name and whatever that quote would be, then do they fully understand the risks? Are you prepared to give them a platform that might end up, because there are cases of people who I think it was sort of vox pops on the streets of Moscow where people criticized the war, and these people were subsequently found by the police or the FSB or whoever it was, and they had a criminal case initiated against them. So that seemed to place an extra responsibility on journalists, I think, which I think you journalists always have, but is very acute in this situation. What publicity are you prepared to give people? Are you prepared to be that platform that ends up facilitating someone spending years in jail?
Yes, you don't want to be party to that. And working in such an organization, do you have to have a really sort of intimate understanding, a realistic understanding of how the so-called power vertical works? How it leaks information out, if indeed it does, what the different factions are, the different struggles that underpin it, because the facade we see is fairly smooth and unbroken. It doesn't have that much transparency. How do you go about sort of really understanding the inner mechanics? Or is it like criminology? Is it actually impossible, a bit like tea leaf reading?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent it is impossible. Yeah, I mean, it's always been very difficult, and now it's even harder. Um, I mean, I think there are some Russian journalists who, have sources that they're. I don't think anyone really has sources at a high level in the Kremlin, but they have sources maybe at a lower level in regional governments or in Moscow government or in the Russian government. There might where maybe they get information, they get a sense of what's going on, in the sort of towers of the Kremlin, as it were. And if you know these journalists and you know where they write, you can sometimes figure out what sort of maybe faction is leaking, what information they're getting from what faction, or so on. Even in wartime, that happens, and even in wartime, the people, Russian politicians, Russian officials are speaking to journalists who, on paper, they wouldn't want to be seen to be speaking to. So there is bits of information that sort of dribbles out, but I think it's very hard. And to be honest, one of the reasons I wrote the book about Pskov region, I was tired of all this energy and like thought that goes into criminology, which is of course important, but particularly with Russia, it sometimes seems that it's kind of excessive, the energy and time and effort that's expended on this by outside observers.
Especially given that only history may give us an inkling of what's really gone on, and even then, a lot of those details may not even be passed down to history itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, did you have a sense from the book? You say it's incredibly pessimistic, and of course, given the current circumstance, it would seem to be not just the scale of the full-scale war, but I think speaking to other people, and I have quite a few Russians on my channel where we try to dive into the economy and the state of the economy. It does seem that Putin has mortgaged is even the wrong word. He has sold the family silver. He is burning everything up in terms of Russia's sovereign wealth funds, its economy, its potential for future development, burning it all up in pursuit of this obsession to subjugate Ukraine and whatever other geopolitical ambitions he has. It seems to me, at least, I'd be interested to hear your view on this, that he's going to keep going until there's nothing left. He has no stop or halt lever on this runaway train. But the implications for Russia are dire. Um, Obviously, we have to mention Ukraine first because their lived experience and their losses are extraordinary. So that to examine Russia's problems isn't to belittle those, but it does seem that Russia has very little future at this point, and whatever future there is sort of is going up in smoke as we speak, day in day out.
Yeah. So I mean, my first job in Moscow was as a business and economy reporter. So I have a little bit of background in. I spent a few years reporting on that, and one of my other hats at the moment is I do some editing for the Bell, which is some independent Russian outlet that focuses on the economy. And yeah, I mean, Putin is showing himself to be completely, Ukraine is his number one priority, and he's prepared to sacrifice um, almost anything, I think, at that altar. And that includes the economy and things that he spent in the 2000s, for example, making the ruble floating currency free, and getting rid of all currency controls in the 2000s, which he expended a lot of political capital and time doing. This all, he just gave that all up in one moment to in order for the invasion to take place. And although Russia is burning through a lot of resources. I mean, my understanding of it is that there's the bottom isn't he's not going to reach the bottom anytime soon. Russia has enough, and the oil price is high enough, and that there's no sort of I mean, you do come across these predictions that Russia is about to implode economically. There's a crisis on the horizon. I don't really, certainly mine, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that is naive. That's maybe more wishful thinking than reality, and I think they could go on for many years.
Years even. And of course, with the 300 billion in Russian central bank assets, if we were stupid enough to hand those back or fail to secure them for another 6 months, that's a huge injection of capital, isn't it, to keep Putin's war machine going?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean I mean, even without that, they have a lot of capital, and yeah, yeah, my understanding is that, yeah, I mean, you never say never. Something could happen, but the Russian economy is in pretty robust health at the moment. I mean, obviously, there will be a problem. This is maybe important when you're thinking about Putin's thinking and calculations. But if the war does end and this huge military spending does come to an end, that is going to cause problems in a way that we see in all economies after war. Russian economy has been militarized. It's a war economy. And if the war goes away, then there's no demand for all this stuff, and the levels of spending will fall, and people will be unemployed, and that will be very difficult. So potentially, an end to the war is even more politically challenging than I mean, it's just another reason for the Kremlin to continue fighting Ukraine. I mean, the other thing that's interesting, particularly when you're thinking about regions like Pskov, Pskov is one of Russia's poorest regions. Has seen a particularly, the numbers of people volunteering to fight in Ukraine are, one of the highest in Western Russia. It seems per capita one of some of the highest casualty levels of any region in Russia. But what the Russia's wartime economy has done is redistribute wealth to regions like Pskov in a way, that would not have happened otherwise, and is in some some ways it's quite a left-wing sort of approach that money has been taken away from the center and redistributed to these regions via military spending. So all the the blue-collar jobs associated with military spending, from anything from it's not just making tanks, but all the stuff that needs to go into tanks or anything else, or drones or whatever. All these jobs, they're in very high demand. There's the unemployment in Russia is now record low. Which means wages go up. So people doing these jobs are getting more money than ever. There's also been a big, redistribution of wealth via the huge amounts that are paid to volunteer soldiers in Russia, and also the huge amounts that are paid to the families of soldiers if they're killed. So all this has kind of channeled money to some of the poorer places in Russia, redistributed some of this wealth. You know, and if it wasn't, if the consequence of this wasn't war and the horrific things Russia is doing in Ukraine, then it might be something that you would praise as a sort of economic model. But yeah, to be honest with you, I didn't see any the last time I was in Pskov was in February 2023, and I didn't see any signs of this sort of wealth, this new wealth. But with time, I think it probably will show itself. And I mean, I came across recently this quite horrifying statistic that the amount of money that Russia is paying its people who volunteer to go fight in Ukraine. So if you calculate if you join up, you get a big sign-on bonus. You fight for a certain amount of time, and then you're killed, and the money that's paid out to your family, if you that pot of money, if you compare that to the average amount that someone like the Pskov region would earn over the course of their entire life, that pot is bigger than so these men they're literally worth more dead than alive, which is it's extraordinary what that does to a society.
It's a kind of obscenity, isn't it? And of course, we've talked a lot on the channel, I think, disparagingly about the motives people have for war. And as I said, we have emphasized, because if you listen to Zolkin, his interviews, many of the people he brings up will have mentioned the monetary inducement. But at the same time, when you put it in that context, that this is more money than they could earn by living, or firstly doing civilian jobs, and then on top of that by simply surviving, that puts it in some kind of context. But again, the blame comes back to central government, who has essentially ignored and abandoned these regions for a long time, and abandoned these people to extraordinary sort of penury. Again, quite a depressing thought, but interesting, this redistribution, which of course will be wiped out if the economy does implode. I mean, the last bit there, I'm fascinated to hear that, because if you listen to someone like Vladimir Milov and Michael Naki and others, you'll get an impression that we are teetering on a precipice. That Putin's bank is technically, in default. But of course, they won't let it, actually decline. You have property-related companies, the biggest ones about to go bust, etc., etc. But you're seeing things that indicate that actually there's plenty more gas in the tank.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would stress that I'm really not an economic expert, but so this newsletter for the Bell that I edit, which is written by, it was in English, and it's just gone behind the paywall, but you can subscribe. It's in English. It's written by Alexander Prokopenko and Alexander Kalyander, and they're both economic experts. And that is very much, I'm just sort of regurgitating their line, which is that this is, this idea that Russia's on the brink of some sort of economic disaster is wishful thinking. There's not the data doesn't really support that. They have problems. Inflation is very high, but we've seen this extraordinary redistribution of wealth, inflation at the moment has sort of peaked and is maybe now on its way down. The interest central bank rate is very high, but again, and that does cause problems for business. But again, it's not. It doesn't seem to be. It's not something that's going to trigger some sort of economic meltdown. And there are plenty of there's plenty left in the sovereign wealth funds, and the oil price is relatively high. And they're making a lot of money from raw material exports. It doesn't. There's no sort of. They in the sense that I'm just sort of telling you what they write about every week. It seems very much that there's no collapse is imminent, and and very much believing and thinking that is wishful thinking. I mean, wishful thinking coming from a probably come from a good place, but it's wishful thinking nonetheless. Yeah.
Yeah, and we should definitely base our strategies on reality
Mhm.
rather than on black swan events, which I'm sure Ukrainians are not counting on Russia imploding, but are rather counting on their own defense. This has been absolutely thrilling conversation, Howard. Thank you so much. I will remind people again. Here we go. This might help. It's a fantastic book. If you are intrigued by what you've heard about so Pskov region and the experiences that Howard writes about there, as well as the characters he meets, then the link to that book will be in the description of the video. For today, though, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.